Cornell Armstrong's return to Miami didn't last long. That's the headline. But headlines never tell you the whole truth, do they? There's always a layer underneath the paper, something that doesn't show up on the transaction report or in the injury list. When Armstrong was cut loose again, it didn't just close a chapter. It reopened an old one that this team seems to revisit every season. Injuries, rotations, short-term contracts, and that constant dance between hope and the next man up. Armstrong's story was never built on flash. He wasn't the kind of player who soaked up headlines or made a stadium hold its breath. He was the kind who slipped into the lineup quietly, did the work, and left just as quietly. But this time, there's something heavier about it. Maybe it's because he clawed his way back to the roster after everyone else already had a seat. Maybe because when he came in, it wasn't about proving anything grand. It was just survival. He arrived back in Miami this summer, like someone returning to an old neighborhood that's changed too much to feel like home. He had been drafted by this team, cut, bounced around, and then brought back when the cornerback room started thinning out like it always seems to. A sixth-round pick in 2018, a familiar face in a locker room full of shifting names. Nothing glamorous about it, just the grind. But now, with that hamstring injury, the grind hit a wall. He went on injured reserve, and by Friday, he was off the roster again, released with an injury settlement. It sounds clean on paper, doesn't it? Released with an injury settlement. But behind that simple line, there's the frustration of watching film alone, of rehab sessions that feel longer than the days themselves, of knowing you're fighting for a spot that's already being handed to someone else. The technical part says he could come back next year. In theory, that's true. But football rarely lives in theory. There's a rule that says he has to sit out the number of games equal to the settlement plus 3 more before re-signing with his former team. It's a cold, structured way to say, don't get your hopes up. Armstrong had played 3 games before the injury, stepping in after Jason Marshall Jr., the rookie 6th-rounder, also landed on IR with a hamstring issue. For 3 games, Armstrong was that bridge between what could have been and what had to be done. 21 snaps a game. Small numbers on paper, but every one of them was a heartbeat in a defense trying to stay steady while its edges kept falling apart. Then came Carolina, the 27-24 loss that felt like more than a loss. Somewhere in the middle of that game, Armstrong pulled up, another hamstring gone. The same script, different name. And that was it. No cinematic ending, no big send-off. Just the quiet paperwork that moves on without you. Now, the Dolphins will probably shift the nickel role to one of the safeties. Maybe Minkah Fitzpatrick, maybe Ifeatu Melifonwu. Either way, the message is the same. Adapt or collapse. This defense doesn't have time for sentiment. But if you followed this team long enough, you know that depth has been their ghost story for years. Every time it seems stable, someone else goes down, and the patchwork begins again. It's strange how names can blur in a season. One week you're hearing about Armstrong's hustle, the next you're reading about Melifonwu's versatility. And before you realize it, half the defense is made of guys who weren't even on the roster in July. That's the modern NFL. It's not about building statues anymore. It's about keeping the lineup breathing. But that doesn't mean fans don't feel the weight of it. Every time a player like Armstrong goes, there's this quiet recognition. He wasn't a superstar, no. But he was one of those names you rooted for because he wasn't the superstar. The kind who reminds you that football isn't all end zones and glory. Sometimes it's just the fight to stay visible. And maybe that's the most Miami thing about this whole story. This city, this team, it's always been about the edge between resilience and heartbreak. The Dolphins have built their identity on comeback energy, on the promise that even when the roster changes, the fight doesn't fade. But it wasn't just Armstrong making moves this week. The ripple spread to a few familiar names, the kind that make you pause mid-scroll because you remember where you were when they had their moments. Brandon Pili, for one, the big man from the defensive line, the one who used to plug the gaps like a wall of noise. He's now on Seattle's active roster after being elevated 3 times from the practice squad. The kind of story that makes you grin a little, because you know what it means for a player to finally get that spot. Meanwhile, Matt Haack, remember him? The punter who helped craft Mountaineer shot. One of the most unforgettable trick plays this team ever pulled off. He was out there trying out for the Arizona Cardinals, battling for a job, and got edged out by Pat O'Donnell, a guy who used to boot balls at the University of Miami. There's something ironic in that. A former Dolphin losing a job to a guy from the same city. The NFL loves its circles. Ben Still, another familiar face from training camp, got a look from the Steelers. He's the kind of player who always seemed like he'd make it, just needed that one more break. It's strange how often that one more break never comes. The line between staying and slipping is thinner than the white paint on the sidelines. Then there's Eric Ezukama, fourth-round pick in 2022, a name that once carried that potential label fans love to hang on to. He had a shot with the Jaguars, landed on their practice squad, and then was released. Now he's had a tryout with the 49ers, a fresh start maybe. It's easy to forget how quickly things change in this league. 1 minute you're running routes under Miami sun. The next you're catching passes in a San Francisco drizzle, wondering if this will finally be the team that sticks. And Andrew Armstrong, the undrafted receiver from Arkansas who gave it a run in camp, was right there with Ezukama trying out for San Francisco too. It's almost poetic, the way their paths crossed again after both drifting from Miami. Maybe that's what the league is, a series of almosts and reunions. Even Baron Matos, the Dominican tackle who carried that International Pathway Program tag last season, found his name back in the conversation. He met with the Steelers this week, still chasing that elusive foothold. He was waived injured in August, but the story's not over yet. For players like him, it never really ends. It just pauses between opportunities. So, when you step back and look at the day's transactions, the releases, the signings, the tryouts, it paints a picture that's not about stats or depth charts. It's about survival in a system that never slows down. Every name on that list once wore the same colors, heard the same crowd, ran out of the same tunnel. And now they're scattered across different cities, still chasing the same sound, the roar that says you belong here. You can't help but think, how many times has this cycle repeated? How many times have we seen someone get their shot, make a few plays, get hurt, and fade into the former Dolphin category? It's like this constant motion that defines the team more than any single player could. And yet, somehow, through all that motion, the Dolphins stay relevant. They keep pushing. Every time the roster thins out, every time a corner goes down, someone else steps up. It doesn't always work. You can see that in the losses that sting longer than they should, but it keeps them alive. Armstrong's story fits right into that rhythm. Not glamorous, not headline-worthy, but necessary. You can't build a roster on stars alone. You need the quiet grinders, the ones who take 21 snaps a game and make them count. You need the ones who come back even when the odds say not to. Still, it's hard not to wonder, how many more times can this defense stretch before it breaks? The cornerback depth is a recurring nightmare, and yet somehow, the coaching staff always finds a way to stitch it back together. Maybe it's resilience, maybe it's stubbornness, maybe it's just Miami refusing to give in. When Sunday rolls around and the Chargers come to town, that nickel spot will be under a microscope. Whoever lines up there, Fitzpatrick, Melifonwu, maybe even someone unexpected, will carry not just the weight of the playbook, but the echo of every guy who's filled that space before. Armstrong's absence will linger quietly in that corner of the field, even if no one says his name out loud, because that's the truth of this game. Not everyone gets their comeback. Some stories end on a Friday afternoon with a press release and a few lines about an injury settlement. But if you've followed this team long enough, you know those stories matter just as much as the touchdowns. They're the connective tissue that keeps this whole thing human. And maybe that's the real heartbeat of the Miami Dolphins right now. Not the stars, not the records, but the constant rebuilding, the endless rotation of names that remind us football isn't static. It's fluid, messy, unforgiving, and somehow beautiful in the way it keeps moving forward, no matter who falls behind. Armstrong's chapter might be closed for now, but his fingerprints are still on this season. Every tackle, every snap, every time he lined up in that nickel spot, it all feeds into the next man's moment. That's how this team has always lived. One player leaves, another steps in, and the fight goes on. And if you're watching closely, you can almost feel it. That pulse that says no matter how many times the roster changes, no matter who comes or goes, the Dolphins are still out there, chasing something that's just a little bigger than the box score.